Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema podcast YouTube channel. You can also check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema, where you can get early access to reviews, brief mini reviews on movies and TV shows that I've seen for the first time, as well as this month I've done a rundown of my favorite film music of 2020. Next month I'm going to be doing some exclusive reviews about the DCEU in preparation for the Zack Snyder Justice League, and that is at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. About a month ago, I had the chance to guest star on a podcast called Binge Movies, and it was really fun. And I invited one of the co-hosts of that to join me on my podcast, and we're going to have a little bit of fun with this discussion. We're going to sort of do something akin to sort of what they do on Binge Movies, and I'm pleased to be joined by Jason from Binge Movies tonight. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for letting me come on your show. I appreciate being here.
What was the inspiration behind Binge Movies? What inspired you to come up with that concept?
Well, for me it was my dad. I grew up in the VHS era, the video store era. Mm-hmm. As maybe some of your listeners did. My dad grew up in the Palace Theater, the Movie Palace era. He didn't have me until he was almost into his 40s. And he grew up in Oklahoma, outside of Oklahoma City, before Oklahoma City was really built up. And it gets so hot during the summer, it would just reach a point where the parents didn't have anything for their kids to do, and it was too hot to be outside. And so the only air-conditioned place in town was the local Movie Palace. And that they marketed, hey, bring your kids here and pay a flat fee, and we'll show them old adventure serials and newsreels and Three Stooges shorts and movies. And everything was a double feature back then. And for a flat rate, you could be there pretty much all day and get snacks and candy and whatever. And it was like their version of daycare, basically. And him and his sister, my aunt, would do that. And so it sort of impressed upon him this habit from a very early age of like the way to consume movies is to watch a ton of them at the same time. And so when I came around and video stores were all the rage and home video was just becoming a thing, we obviously got our VCR, and every Friday and most Saturdays we would go to the video store, and he would rent 4 to 6 tapes for Friday, and then we'd take them back in the morning and we'd get 4 to 6 more. And that's pretty much what we did every weekend. And I don't think I consciously realized that was the inception of Binge Movies, but that's how I've always sort of consumed movies, is like lumping them together and making connections and watching a bunch of content at the same time. And I fast forward to the podcast era, one of my favorite movie podcasts suddenly quit up out of nowhere after a few years, and it was like 2 years and they still weren't coming back, and I really couldn't find anything to replace what the feeling that show had. And then I thought to myself, what if I could produce a show that would not be identical to that, but would produce that same feeling in other people, that you're in a conversation with friends or friendly people about movies, and you really feel like you're in the room, and you really feel like you're a part of the show, and you're part of the humor and like camaraderie. And I think that's one thing that podcasts offer a lot of people, whether it be long drives to work or working from home now because of COVID over the last year. It kind of puts another voice in the room and lets you feel like you're having a conversation, even though you're kind of not. So those two things kind of coalesced, and that was the start of Binge Movie.
Okay. Yeah. So the episode, I'll go ahead and tease the episode that we did. I was part of. You've been going through the 10 highest grossing movies of the 1990s.
Yep.
on the podcast, and we did numbers 6 through 10 of 1998 recently.
Yep.
And I'm looking forward to people listening to that. And it was honestly, it was a lot of fun. The more there, like I said on the podcast, there's a part of me that was kind of disappointed I didn't get 5 through 1 because of the fact that there are some great films to talk about there. But honestly, I really like the variety of discussion that could be had with the 5 that we ended up talking about. And I'm looking forward to sharing that episode with people. It was a lot of fun to record.
Yeah, it was great having you on. I mean, that's kind of what the show is, right? We binge 5 movies. They're all built around a theme. So you came on for, the top grossing films of 1990, whatever. Like you said, we've done the series. So you're there for 98 and, 10 through 6. And so that's what brings those movies together. But it could be a different theme. It doesn't have to be about gross. It could just be about whatever. We're at some point we're going to do a Killer Kids episode, which is going to be 5 movies about killer kids. And then what you do is you watch them, we review them, and then we rank them. And then we have what we call the short list, which is my list, and then we have the guest list because we have guest hosts who do it with me on a weekly basis. You were one of those. So your best of that particular week gets added to the guest list. And then at the end of the season, because we do about 4 seasons a year, at the end of each season, we then have what we call Last Movie Standing, where we get 2 guest film critics or podcasters to come on. They take my short list and the guest list, and they have a snake debate, kind of college debate format, but a little bit more fun, a little bit more loose, but still with some structure to it. And they have a nice friendly debate about which one movie is worthy of preservation for all time, even beyond the end times. And that movie goes into our no copyright infringement intended vault. And that's really what Binge Movies is about. We're not just watching these movies just to talk about them, but we're trying to assess what are those movies that have the most merit, regardless of overall genre or quality or the year it came out. We're trying to essentially create a collection, a canon of film out of our vault that, we have some exploitation movies in there. We've got some big box office winners in there. We've got some nostalgia favorites in there, but it all comes down to merit. It can't just be based on box office or nostalgia. Like, what is it about this movie and what it represents to film history that would make it significant? So, it's sort of that thought experiment of if you could only curate X amount of material to show people if aliens from another world came and said, like, what are movies? And you could only show them a handful of the best examples. That's kind of what we're getting at. And we have someone described our show as both intensely analytical and intensely ridiculous. And I think that is the spirit of the show. Is we try to walk that line, which is hard to do. We try to walk that line of being a little out there, a little weird, a little zany at times, but also still analytical and actually try to do some kind of film criticism.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the most entertaining aspects of joining the show because of the fact that the 5 movies we did, like, all of them are very much popcorn movies in a lot of ways, even though one of them was an Oscar winner. And being able to sort of look at those from a critical eye, as well as just having fun talking about them, is one of the things that was so much fun to be on that show. And I love the idea of, I think that's one of the things that's so engaging about your show is the fact that you're not necessarily going to be talking about the same movies that everybody else is talking about. And
we try not to.
Look, there's some value. There can be some value to that, but at the same time, it's like you're basically. It's great to have a niche that you're feeding into, and I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about this because, like, for instance, in R5, like we talked about everything from Dr. Dolittle to Lethal Weapon 4 to Shakespeare in Love. And it's like, I can't think of 3 movies that are more different than any of those, but putting them in the context of, oh, these were some of the biggest box office hits of that year, you're kind of able to figure something out, not just about like that movie year, but sort of like what was it about these movies that drove people to watch them in the first place.
Yep. Well, Brian, you've been doing this a long time and talking about film and writing about film.
Yeah.
And so you're an OG with this, but you and I are roughly the same age. So you probably remember when Siskel and Ebert had a TV show and when Gene Siskel was still with us.
Yeah.
And every week that show would come out, whether it was on PBS in the old days or whether it was in syndication once Disney bought them. But regardless, they talked about 4 to 4, 5, 6 movies every single episode. And none of those movies had anything in common with each other for the most part, other than those were that week's releases or those were the movies they were reviewing that week. And that's kind of how film criticism used to work, if you remember.
Yeah.
Right? The newspaper, when people read newspapers, like here are the movies that are coming out, and you had either your local film critic or like the AP, whoever was in syndication or a combination thereof, and you'd look in your local newspaper and you would read 4 or 5 reviews for the 4 or 5 movies that were coming out that weekend to pick which movie you're going to watch.
Yeah.
And that's with the internet, that's kind of been lost, especially, with magazines and newspapers. They don't exist. They don't have the power that they used to have. A lot, traditional film criticism that you and I grew up with doesn't have the same voice that it did, which on the one hand is good because it gives fans entry into the conversation. On the other hand, there is this line that we cross of like, what is actual film criticism? And forgive me for using this word, but like, what is fanboyism, right? Like, are we just a marketing arm for the latest releases because we're fans of, say Marvel or DC or whatever. And so we're not really being critical of these movies in the truest sense of that word. We're either we hate them and we're just trying to be as shocking in our takes to get clicks, or we're just basically a marketing arm of like, hey, check out the new trailer for we're just free PR for movies, as opposed to thinking critically about the movies. And that's why a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. I think what we're trying to do, and we're not always successful, is in the midst of the anarchy and the wackiness and bizarreness sometimes of what our show is, and the humor and the jokes and the meta-ness of it all, and the lore and everything that we do in the show, in the midst of that, we're kind of trying to refine that spirit, which is why we try to have other, people who are writing, people who are doing podcasts, people who are, I guess what I'm saying is we try to be selective of who our guests are so we can kind of thread that needle and do both.
Yeah.
We want to be entertaining in our own right, but we also want to be informative. And I never thought I would sit down and like have a 25-minute discussion with an internet friend about Eddie Murphy's Dr. Dolittle reboot from the 90s. But we did, and we got into some interesting conversation there,
Yeah.
So you never know. And I think, I love the movies that everybody loves too, or I want to talk 2021, I'm excited for Dune. I know everyone's going to talk about Dune. I want to talk about Dune. We'll probably talk about Dune. We have what we call instant reactions on the show, which are like bonus features, which are, as new movies come out, we just sort of, we'll pick and choose and talk about them very briefly and do kind of a short review, just literally an instant reaction to it. So I talk about the major stuff as well, but I think having a little bit of distance, and I think having other people's perspective like yours, and I think putting them together, it changes the way that we talk about movies in an interesting way. So that's the heart of the show, and I hope you had a good time. It sounds like you did.
Yeah, and I mean, one of my favorite things is one of the things that I certainly hope for, and one of the things that I find most rewarding, especially about the conversation we had, is that it wasn't just 2 people who had the same feelings about the same movies. Like you and I had very different feelings on some of those movies,
Yes.
And I mean, that's one of the things that
Yeah.
it's one thing for like it's one thing to have like genuine, appreciation for something that you agree with somebody on and you can share that and record and talk about, but it's another thing to get engaged in a genuine critical conversation about, well, what works about this movie for you versus what works about this movie for me.
Right.
And I think that's one, especially, and I think that's part of the reason why ultimately the movies that we did talk about in that episode were ones that I enjoyed talking about because of the fact that we ended up we didn't have fundamentally the same feelings on all of those, that even the ones
Right.
that we did agree on.
Yeah.
And
Right. Exactly.
yeah.
Yep. No, you're exactly right. And that's the thing is like you and I can both, if we're just giving scores, you and I might land in the same score. And we do, right? We give scores on binge movies and we do rankings. And we may end up at the same ranking, the same score, but for wildly different reasons.
Yeah.
And to me, that's where the money is, and that's where the fun of it is you're going to see something different in Shakespeare in Love or Dr. Dolittle or whatever than I am. Or today we're talking about 3 movies that are off the beaten path. Like we may end up vehemently disagreeing, or we may end up vehemently agreeing.
Yeah.
But for completely different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what, like, here's the thing that you and I have in common, regardless of, or people who are listening to your show, or people who listen to binge movies, or people we're friends with on film Twitter, we're all movie lovers.
Mm-hmm.
And most of us are movie obsessives, if we're going to be honest with it, right? And for a variety of reasons, we find comfort there. They help us process our feelings, our thoughts, our emotions. We not everybody is. I've got tons of friends who maybe watch 2 or 3 movies a year through. They and I'm not talking about going to the theater. They may not go to the theater at all. They just don't. If it's on cable, it's on in the background when something else is going. But to sit down and focus solely on a movie, they may only watch a handful a year.
Yeah.
That's not you, and that's not me. And that's not most people listening to this, right? Like we're the sort of people who are like, we're going to watch a handful of movies this weekend or tonight, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've been doing like 2-3 movies a day the past few days. I mean, today's really the only time that I did like one, but it was because of the fact that, I mean, I've been doing so much in the past few days. I was like, I'm going to take a little bit of a break.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'm basically going to pretty much go back to that grind of 2-3 movies a day, tomorrow. So, and it's for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's a movie that I'm reviewing. Sometimes it's going to be a movie that I'm watching for awards purposes. And, sometimes it's just going to be a movie that I watch for the hell of it. I mean, sometimes, and I will admit there are times where that last part, it's hard to do when you're doing so much watching for podcasts or reviews and stuff like that. But like when you get a chance to watch a movie just for the sake of watching it, whether it's something that, I've never seen this before, or hey, it's something that I haven't watched in a while. Like I just rewatched Runaway last night. And it's like I was in that mood of like mood of like 80s because of the movies that we're talking about today. Yeah. I was in the mood for like 80s, 90s sci-fi, and I'm like, I haven't seen Runaway in a while, so it's like it's on Prime. I'm gonna watch it, and it's one of those things where it's like that type. Sometimes it's hard to fit those type of viewings in. And I think that's always kind of important for us to be able to do.
Well, they're like palate cleansers too. And it connects when you're a content creator, and I don't really like that term because it sounds yucky, but when you're at some point we have things that we're passionate about, those become hobbies or parts of our lifestyle. And then maybe we try to monetize that or whatever. We try to like build a platform around that because we're that into it. We're that obsessive about it. And then that eventually, like the thing that we're passionate about and the thing that we love becomes a job like anything else, right? It becomes like you still enjoy it. It's not digging ditches, but it becomes like, okay, like it's something we have to do as opposed to something we get to do. And so every once in a while, it's great to like have a reset where it's like, I'm not doing this for a podcast or for a blog or for a written review. I'm not submitting this to publication. I'm not doing this for even Letterboxd. I'm just doing it because I like movies and I just need to unplug from the machinery of it all and just get back to like my first love kind of a thing. And when we do that, it ends up making the content on the back end better too. Yeah. And even if it doesn't, it's just worth it because we're reconnecting with why we fell in love with movies in the first place.
Yeah. Before we get to the discussion of the 3 movies tonight, where can people find your podcast?
The podcast itself is pretty much everywhere. We're on Spotify. We are on, obviously, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spreaker, TuneIn, Google Podcast. Anywhere where you find podcasts, you'll find us. The best thing you can do is, regardless of where you subscribe, like every podcaster out there, leave us a review, leave us a 5-star review. That helps all of us out. As far as like our social media and stuff like that, we're exclusively on Twitter at Binge Movies. Really simple. We're also on Letterboxd, letterboxd.com/Binge Movies. And if you're a Podbean aficionado, it's just bingemovies.podbean.com as our site. And that's it. It's all right there. Pretty simple.
Excellent. And yes, check it out if you haven't listened to Binge Movies before. It's really an entertaining show. And with that, I thought it might be fun to bring a little bit of Binge Movies to the Sonic Cinema podcast as sort of an introduction to the podcast if you haven't listened to it. So when we were talking about this part of the podcast where you would join me, I originally asked you for 3 movies in like your favorite genre, and then you were like, well, I don't really have a favorite genre. It's like, well, what about like 3 of your favorite movies? And it's like, I'll get back to you. And then you came back to me with the 3 movies that we are going to be talking about tonight. I'm curious, and I'll admit, like, these are all movies I'd never seen before.
Yeah.
So what was it that inspired you to do these 3 movies in particular?
I'm just, it's a loaded question, Brian. I saw your tweet where you're like, I'm 5 minutes into the first movie for Binge Movies, and I'm thinking about calling the whole thing off. That was part of the inspiration. No, for me, it was, there's something about talking about, these are not my 3 favorite movies of all time, but there's something about talking about movies that are underseen, underthought about, underappreciated, and maybe underappreciated is too strong of a word. I wouldn't qualify or quantify any of these necessarily as hidden gems, but movies that are out there and are available and have almost no legacy, or a very small legacy. And there's something interesting about those movies because they haven't been picked over to death, and it's easier in my mind. They lead to more fun conversation and to because I don't have any, like, if we're going to sit here and talk about Inception, for instance, I probably have a good idea of what you're going to say about Inception, not because you're not a unique and creative person, but because I've heard millions of people talk about Inception. I have no damn idea what you're going to say about Trancers.
and we'll go ahead and start. So the first movie is 1984's Trancers, which is directed by Charles Band. And I will say, like, before we get in too deep into discussing Trancers, I will say it's like, as I was watching all 3 of these movies, I did feel like there is a common similarity. Like, they're all like sci-fi horror type things where they're all have a little bit of zombie element into them. So it's like
Yep.
there's a little bit of a connection there. And it was and this was the movie I was talking about where it's like in that tweet where it's like, yeah, I'm 5 minutes into this, I'm not sure whether to be excited or whether to just call it quits. But so the first movie is Transfers, which is directed by Charles Band. It can be currently seen on Tubi, which is how I watched it.
Yep.
And what you typically do is you ask for like a simple sort of one line sort of log line about how you would describe this movie. So the way I would describe this is a Blade Runner ripoff turns into a Terminator ripoff.
Yes. And then becomes the genesis for Assassin's Creed.
Yeah. The thing that struck me so much about this movie is that I had no idea there were like 5 of these. Like I had no idea.
There's 6 of them.
Oh my God, 6.
Yes.
But the thing is, but it also doesn't surprise me because of the fact that the ending of this one is one of those gratuitous sequel setups where it's like, oh hey, of course there's going to be a second movie in here. I have to say though, it's like I ended up enjoying this one like more than I expected. It's even though it's so very blatantly obvious that the first few minutes are basically ripped off from Blade Runner, and then the premise itself is essentially Terminator. This is a fun movie.
Well, what's so odd about this movie? Okay, I think this, if I'm not mistaken, this is the feature film debut of Helen Hunt.
Mm-hmm.
And she's in 2 of the 6 sequels. She's in Trancers 1 and Trancers 2.
Yeah.
This stars Tim Thomerson, who, if you're a genre fan or if you grew up in the 80s and you went to video stores, you probably know who he is. He made a few appearances in some like actual mainstream releases, but for the most part, he's sort of how do you quantify him? He's basically like a B movie god.
Yeah.
He's in Trancers. He had multiple franchises that were almost all under the Charles Band Empire Pictures / Full Moon umbrella, which is Trancers, which is like his marquee franchise, and then the Doll Man series, which had the immaculate Doll Man versus Demonic Toys crossover movie. So you had multiple franchises crossing over. And by Doll Man, he is the Doll Man. He is a cop who is shrunk down to doll size. And that is the plot of Doll Man. Now, in Trancers, not only is it blatantly a Blade Runner ripoff, especially the beginning.
Yeah.
He then has to travel through time because in this world, it's also like a Scanners ripoff, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is a psychic bad guy who has the ability to take over people's minds and use them as he pleases, do his evil bidding. You know, he can Jedi mind trick. He can take over the weak-minded. And they somehow become zombies when he does this, or basically zombies. And he can speak through them. He's traveled back into the past. In this world, time travel doesn't work like Terminator. It works like Assassin's Creed, just like 25 years earlier, which is you can only travel through your own bloodline.
Yeah.
So your body can't go back in time, but your consciousness can through your bloodline and into an ancestor. And the Tim Thomerson plays Jack Death.
Yep.
And
that name.
Yes, it's just amazing. That name is amazing. And he's hamming it up for all of his glory. And what's so weird is you're right, it's a Terminator ripoff, but it came out in 1984. So this is either like the fastest turnaround in production time ever, or somebody saw Cameron's script floating around and took elements of it, or maybe they just saw the trailer for Terminator and then made a movie off of the trailer, which I wouldn't put it past Charles
Right.
Band.
So it's funny because of the fact that it came out in the UK in November of '84, which would put right around the time Terminator came out. But
Yep.
it didn't hit the United States until May of 1985, which is interesting because of the fact that it's like, I guess the thinking was probably, oh, we'll wait a little bit longer and then, we'll sort of ride on the Terminator's coattails.
Right.
And and it's funny because of the fact that I wonder if this was sort of an inspiration a little bit of Demolition Man as well, because of the fact that the main character originally thinks that Whistler, the villain, is dead, and he's told, no, he's not. You have to go get him. And it's like, it's not completely Demolition Man, but it has some similar elements.
I think there's a certain B movie veneer to this that is also, 10 years later, or roughly 9 years later, on Demolition Man.
Yeah.
And I think honestly, I think that's what's so interesting to talk about this sort of film for two reasons. If your listeners are old enough, they should, and once again, if they frequented video stores, Full Moon, Charles Band basically figured out, he took essentially the Roger Corman format, but rather than apply it to like midnight movies or drive-in theaters, he did it for home video. There was such a ravenous hunger for home video that the major studios, there weren't the number of movies being produced that there are now.
Yeah.
By major studios.
Yeah.
And so you could very easily see all of the new major releases and go to your video store and be like, I've seen everything that's in the store.
Mm-hmm.
So it created this, it's not even a secondary market, but they created this like B movie market, or recreated a B movie market, not the drive-in, but at your local mom and pop. And Full Moon was definitely the king of that, which is they would put movies into production. They had a stable of people that they used. They'd put them in production very, very, very quickly, and they'd get them out. And they were, what I would say is, they were slightly better than your average straight-to-video movie. They were not. This Trancers one, I think, had a theatrical release in the States very briefly. Did not do well. All the other Trancers went straight to video.
Mm-hmm.
Most of his movies went straight to video. He ended up producing most of them and having other people direct and this, that, whatever. But I mean, he's got the Subspecies franchise. He's got the Trancers franchise. And the thing is, these tapes were being rented, right? So nobody knows Trancers now. There's 6 of them for a reason, because they made money. They made a lot of money. Yeah. And because you would create a B movie, and you do awesome box art that was indistinguishable from a professional release. You put most of your money in the box art, if we're being honest. Yeah. And then people are going to the video store looking for something to watch on a Friday or Saturday night. They didn't know the difference, right? And so they were just picking it up. It's not like now where it's like you see something on Amazon Prime Video, or Tubi that's like a newer B movie, and it's just made by consumer camera. Yeah. And you can just tell it's junk that's just thrown on there, and it's just a cheap, bad Photoshop job of a poster, and you're like, you immediately know it's crap. Yeah. In the 80s, it was easier to trick us into watching movies like Trancers. And what's interesting, the second thing that's interesting about it is Hollywood, these high concept sci-fi action horror movie mashups were all the rage in the 80s, and some of them were blockbusters. Some of them were box office gold. And then, to your point of Demolition Man, into the 90s, this was what makes the Demolition Man script any better or worse than the Trancer script, other than you have better actors and better talent and bigger budgets, right? Yeah, yeah. No, but premise-wise, what's the difference, right?
Oh yeah, I mean this fits completely in with the aesthetic of action sci-fi movies in the 80s. where it's like
Yeah.
you have these cheesy lines of dialogue, you have these ridiculous plots. I mean, I think one of the things that I actually ended up liking about all of these is I'm a huge Mystery Science Theater 3000 fan. So it's
Yeah.
like I love the idea of watching like cheesy movies, and you know, they're making fun of them, but it's like it's being able to watch that type of thing is a lot of fun because
Yep.
of you, especially if you love movies, you can really see the cliches, you can really see how ridiculous the premises are. And I mean, I one of my favorite things that I wrote down about this was somebody actually says, "What kind of name is Jack Death?" And it's
Yes,
like this
yes.
self-awareness to say
Yes.
that
Yeah.
is just awesome in this movie.
Well, that was the thing I was going to key in on. Once again, when your dad's pulling 6 tapes from the video store every weekend, we got a lot of Full Moon in that grocery bag. It was just, there was a Disney movie, there was a whatever the big franchise or action movie was. There was something that he could watch with my mom, some kind of Harrison Ford, political thriller drama or something with Robert Redford, and then there was a B movie, horror movie, or sci-fi movie. And what I think is so many of those movies, whether they be mainstream Hollywood or Charles Band version of Hollywood, a lot of them are very self-serious.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I saw Trancers way back in the day, and I think they would replay the franchise on Sci-Fi Channel in the 90s, back when they were showing that kind of stuff, before they were producing original sci-fi original movies.
Mm-hmm.
What struck me this time in watching it for the first time in 25 years probably is how it doesn't take itself serious. I mean, it kind of does. It's not a parody. It's not a spoof. But there's a lot of self-referential. They lean into the cliches, but then whether it be Helen Hunt's character or even Jack Death himself, they point out the cliches.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that it makes using cliches any better, but at least when you're laughing with them at the movie, it doesn't really feel like you're laughing at it in a mocking way.
Yeah.
It feels more like you're laughing with it because it feels like the movie's in on the joke.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that you appreciate about like Tim Thomerson, who's in this, Art LaFleur, who plays his boss, who like he would be in, you would see him in a bunch of other stuff. I just saw him again recently rewatching Speed Racer.
Yep.
And like he just, some people just have that ability to play with ridiculous premises. And to a certain extent, Helen Hunt, even at this early in her career, she kind of has that, because
she does.
Because you think about stuff like Twister, where it's like she plays that completely the way you're supposed to play that, where it's like it's essentially this B action movie, and you just kind of run with it. And
well, that's exactly right. So that's a great point you just made. Okay, when we think Twister, maybe younger people don't, but when a lot of us in our age bracket think of Twister, we think of it as and it was, right? We covered it in our retrospective of the top grossing movies of the 90s. It was a massive movie, and it was, at the time, a beloved movie. It's essentially a movie where is it any different than any of the other disaster movies of the 70s? Is it really that different than, Towering Inferno or anything like that, where it's essentially a natural disaster where the nature is presented as a monster? The tornadoes defy the laws of physics. They make no sense. They roar like the dinosaurs from Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a very dumb movie with a lot of cliches, and the couple that's divorced they rediscover their passion and then rediscover their passion for each other. And we've seen all that sort of crap 10 million times. Is it that far removed from Trancers? Like, I don't know that it is.
No, I mean,
it
just happens to have like $100 million or probably like $70 million budget at the time.
And Jan de Bont behind the camera. That's the difference, right? Yeah. Yeah. You've got Jan de Bont and you've got hundreds of millions of dollars
Mhm.
behind it, and at that time especially cutting edge special effects.
Yeah.
These special effects were not cutting edge even in the 60s, some of them.
No.
But some of them in this movie, I'm actually surprised. Some of them aren't that bad, actually.
No, and the thing is, it's like, it's easy to make fun of the opening and basically see that it's a blatant Blade Runner ripoff, but at the same time,
Yeah.
it's like it it gets the atmosphere of what was so appealing about Blade Runner in those
Yep.
first few minutes, and
Yep.
then you have the element of you have going back in time in the Terminator, and the idea that it's because you have to go back inside the body of a relative. It's like, that's interesting. That's an interesting angle to go through this. And there's some interesting set pieces. I feel like there's like a way early version of Bullet Time in this.
Yes.
The first time
Yes.
that Whistler
Yes.
comes in.
Yep.
And it's one of those things where it's like, I mean, if you were going to do Bullet Time in the 90s, in the 80s, that would be the only way you'd really be able to do it. And it's like,
Yep.
it's I mean, maybe part of me was thinking that because of the fact that I just watched the Matrix trilogy, but at the same time, it's like, you watch the fact that it's slow motion and he's
Yep.
dodging the bullets. How can you not think of the Matrix?
No, I mean, that's back to our point, right? It's
Yeah.
like, what's the difference between a B movie and a classic all-time genre film, right?
Mhm.
Like The Matrix, right? There were a ton of cyberpunk, or I think I'm thinking movies like Circuitry Man and all this sort of like dystopian Mad Max ripoff cyberpunk movies.
Yeah.
Blade Runner meets Mad Max sort of stuff, which this is not quite that, but there were a ton of movies that were of the same stock as The Matrix. The only difference is either the skill and quality of the filmmaker, or the budget, or the technology employed to make the movie.
Mhm.
Right. And some of that just comes down to timing too. So when in Trancers, when you see a matte painting at the beginning and you see a spaceship basically chroma keyed in above the diner, it doesn't look like Blade Runner because they didn't have the best of the best in lots of time. They did it in days instead of months.
Yeah.
But there's still something kind of, I don't know, I mean, call me nostalgic, but I get the warm and feely sometimes for optical and practical effects like that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm sort of that way when I hear a 1980s synth score. Like I love that aesthetic of synthesizers, and as cheesy as it sounds now, I mean, it's really effective when it's deployed well. And this one has a decent score. Like, I really enjoyed listening to the score.
Yep.
And yeah, this is one of those things where it's like, it's funny because one of the things I messaged you was like, of course Santa is a trancer.
Of
It's
course.
like, of course he is. Of course he's
Yeah.
Gabby. And it's funny that that happens to be like and you've got a little bit of the fish out of water and stuff like
Yep.
that. And it's like, you have that type of humor as well. And I mean, there's a lot to like. I'm not going to say that this movie is on par with like any of the movies that we're talking about, as far as like
No.
Twister, The Matrix, or
No.
or any of those.
Yeah.
Where it's like, I don't think that, but at the same time, I enjoyed it all the same for exactly what it was. And it's funny because it blows my mind. I didn't realize Helen Hunt was in the first 3 of these, and that preceded Mad About You.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. This was like her start, and I think I'm not sure if it's in this one, but I'm pretty sure it's revealed at some point that she's actually his grandmother. So when they're sleeping together,
I think that is sort of. I think I
Yeah.
do remember that in this one, and it's like,
yeah,
or I think maybe I read it like on Wikipedia or something like that. Reading
That's
about this,
right.
and it's like,
So he's his own grandpa. Yeah.
right. Well, I mean, that in and of itself is a whole other paradoxical science fiction trope somehow, where it's like, I mean, Futurama did that, where it's like Fry is his own grandfather, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
But no, this is I love this. There is something like ridiculously nostalgic about the 80s, and like
Yep.
I really miss. I'm gonna give a plug to one of my favorite podcasts. One of the ones that I got into when I first started really listening to podcasts was 80s All Over, and they didn't get a chance to finish the decade, and it's a shame because I love listening to them talk about these genre movies, from the time, and just really hearing them talk about all of these tropes and stuff that we basically take for granted at this point, and some of which are still going in genre
Oh,
films.
yeah. Yep.
And I've seen so many films that they talk about in that series, and unfortunately, they hadn't gotten to this one by the time the show ended. But it's just great to sort of experience. It's great to hear about some of these movies and think, that might be something I want to check out. And I mean, even this one, it's like there's, I probably don't know that I will have watched this film without you recommending it for the podcast.
Yeah,
but I'm
right.
glad that I've seen it.
Yeah, well, the other great thing about this too, Brian, is the movie. The movie is self-aware enough that when Art LaFleur travels back in time, the only ancestor he can find is a little girl.
Yeah.
So he is that cliche like police captain, basically, where he's like, oh damn it, their downtown's breathing down my neck. So they get a little girl who's still saying that kind of like roughneck police captain, lethal weapon dialogue sort of stuff. And that's funny, but it's also kind of smart in a way because, in a worse B movie or in a worse Hollywood movie, Tim Thomerson goes back and the guy he goes back into basically looks like him, right?
Yeah.
His ancestor basically looks like him. So it's really like, well, if you went back in time, the only ancestor you could find may look nothing like you, may not be the same gender, may not be the same age, so that's at least somebody thought that through. And the other great thing about it is, I think the total runtime is less than 90 minutes. I think it's like an hour and 15 minutes, which is not feature length runtime. So I'm not sure how they got a theatrical release, but they did briefly. And I just think that that's wonderful too, because so many movies that are nothing more than glorified B movies that are made today that have the sheen and pristine of money and names and known actors and stuff behind it. They go on now for 2 hours and 20 minutes. And I think that there's a lot of quote unquote genre movies that come out today that I'm like, if you had been 90 minutes long, you could have been at least a future cult classic.
Yeah.
But you can't be, I'm sorry. I don't think, unless you're like Blade Runner, I don't think you can be a cult classic film and be almost 3 hours long.
No.
Right?
No. Yeah.
But I might say, I'm not going to put Trancers in cult classic status, but had you taken the script, put a little bit more money behind it in that decade, and put Stallone or Schwarzenegger in that role instead of a guy who looks like your dentist or your chiropractor, nothing against Tim Thomerson, because I think Tim Thomerson does a heck of a job. He does a hell of a job. But the only thing that's different between this and The Running Man is that one is based on a Stephen King novel and stars Arnold Schwarzenegger and has Jesse the Body Ventura in it. And this has Helen Hunt before anybody knew who she was. And Thelma Tompkins from Family Matters before anybody knew who she was. And I don't know about you, but the future stuff, I got Quantum Leap vibes a little bit. With just like Ziggy and all of the side characters from Quantum Leap. But anytime you'd see the future with Al and Ziggy and Gushy and all those characters, it felt very reminiscent of the future that Tim Thomerson was from here in Trancers.
Yeah, and I was kind of thinking that part sort of reminded me of 12 Monkeys, where it's like he's basically being recruited to go back in time, and like that the sort of tribunal that he's he's being recruited from is basically along those lines of that movie. It's like that reminded me a lot of that.
Yeah.
But no, this was an entertaining movie. It's like this ended up being more entertaining, and I will say it's like it was nice to see Helen Hunt in an elf costume. Like,
Yeah,
that's
right.
fine. Like, okay,
Playing an 80s punk. So if you've ever wanted to see Helen Hunt playing a semi-punk person in the 1980s and see 80s mall culture and see Tim Thomerson, a guy who looks like your local orthodontist, punch a zombie Santa Claus and shoot him in the face, then Trancers, I think, is for you. Yeah. I think if you're a genre movie fan and you're not aware of the Charles Band oeuvre, maybe check out Trancers. I think it's one of his better movies. Having seen a great many of them, once again, he produced more than he directed, and I think him and his brother, I think, did the score too for a lot of the movies. So it's like it's an in-house kind of a thing. It's Charles Band is the poor man's John Carpenter, I guess. Right?
Yeah, I can see that. And you mentioned punk. There is a wonderful punk cover of Jingle Bells in this that plays in one scene of this that is just delightful to listen to.
Yes.
And actually, like it's funny. Two of these movies this week have like live musical performances within the film that are just completely wild. And like this one was really good. Like,
I think too. They definitely has the feeling of somebody knew somebody who had a band and just put them in the movie. It doesn't feel like it was like a set piece where it's like people pretending to be a band.
Right.
Like I think that's what makes the punk music stand out, because I think they're just really like a local LA punk band, and they were like, "Hey, come be in this movie," and they were in the movie. That was it.
So I'm pretty much done talking about Trancers, and I mean we can go ahead and go to the next one. But one of the things that you do, and you mentioned it talking about binge movies, is you ask us to sort of rate, give a 1 out of 10 number on each movie. So for Trancers, I would say I would go with a 5.8, which is, pretty middle of the road. And actually it's funny because I've got the IMDb up for it, and the user rating is 6.1 for this movie. Which I mean I think is completely fair. It's entertaining, it's kind of goofy, and yes, it's cheesy, but ultimately it's entertaining, which is which goes for a lot.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know what it has on IMDb. I mean, you just told me, but I was going to say I'd put it somewhere around a 6. I watched Trancers and Rebel Without a Cause roughly around the same time, and I will say that I like older films, so this isn't like I don't like old movies kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Because at this point, both of these are old. They're both old movies. Yeah. I will say that I thought the last 25 minutes of Rebel Without a Cause was just insanely inspired filmmaking and was incredibly engrossing, and the movie deserves its credit. But if I had to say which movie did overall I find more entertaining, I would say I think the more entertaining movie is Trancers. It's not the better movie, but it's a more entertaining movie.
No, I mean that is completely a completely fair way to look at it. And I mean the thing is, it's like one of the things I did end up really enjoying to a certain extent all three of the movies that we're talking about tonight, and like it's because of the fact that there's something about like each one that really is just very effective in a B-movie way. And B movies are not supposed to be high art movies. They're just supposed to be entertaining movies. And I think it's like it feels like every few months in the past, couple of years since, Scorsese said what he said about roller coaster theme park movies, it's like we get that discourse sort of on cue as far as like, oh, Marvel movies are movies as well. It's like, well, yes, they are, but they're also like $200 million B movies. It's like, let's be perfectly
That's exactly
clear.
right.
Let's,
That's exactly
let's be
right.
perfectly clear. Even George Lucas would probably admit Star Wars is a B movie.
Absolutely.
I mean, he was up front, like he based on the serials, and it's like those are
Yep.
very B movie, and it's like, yeah, it's like when we start trying to take, what were the big problems with like film discourse right now, and to sort of before we go to the next movie is that I feel like I feel like and it comes down to fandom as well and a protective nature of like especially
Mhm.
like superhero characters and Star Wars and stuff like that where it's like we're sort of losing the fact that these are essentially B movies at their heart.
Yep.
They just
That's
happen to
exactly
have
right.
more money thrown at them than any other genre around.
Well, I mean, you raise an excellent point. I mean, Star Wars ended up in Jaws to some extent, right? That USC film crowd of the Spielberg, Lucas, whatever, they
Yeah.
grew up on B movies like my dad did.
Yeah.
That's what most people saw most of the time because there were a ton more of those. There were a ton more, UFO movies and monster movies and The Blob. There was a ton more of that than there was Rebel Without a Cause, right? It's not to say that there weren't good movies being made, but what most people were seeing at the drive-in, at the Palace Theater, were B movies, or at least if it was a double feature, you might get a good movie, but the first one was going to be trash. I say that respectfully. So when they emerged, I mean, even Cameron worked for Corman, right? He did the matte paintings for Escape from New York, Carpenter, all of these people that we now revere and who then have influenced today's generation of directors like the Russo brothers and other people who are making a lot of these Marvel movies. It all goes back to the B movie, and they took the B movie ideas and what if we punched the scripts up a little bit, and what if we put character actors in place of like bad TV actors, and what if we put a little bit of money behind it, and even more than money, what if we put innovation behind it? And what if we push, what's bad about Buck Rogers is it's not that it isn't fun, it's that the spaceships, you can see that they're hanging on wires. What if you couldn't tell that spaceship was on a wire, right? Boom, you have the birth of Industrial Light and Magic. So, and then that changes the way special effects are done in every movie from that point on. And I think you're exactly right, I think there's a lot of people in the quote unquote discourse who don't really know anything about film history.
Yeah.
And so they don't know that the thing that they're watching that was $300 million to make is a glorified B movie. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Because every once in a while, one of those glorified B movies actually transcends and you get something like the first Terminator, or you get something like Alien. Alien is a B movie. But you know what? It's got a Criterion release.
Yeah.
Because it transcended. Halloween is a B movie as a B movie could get, but you know what? It transcended.
Yeah.
Right? And Terminator 2 off of Terminator. Terminator is an exploitation movie. It's a slasher movie with sci-fi tropes thrown on top of it.
Yeah.
But it leads to the first Terminator is a hell of a movie, and Terminator 2 is a great film.
Yeah.
That plays as well today as it ever did. But it's a B movie. And so there's nothing wrong with being a B movie. There's nothing wrong with being a genre movie. That's okay.
Yeah.
You could be good and be B. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think the discourse gets lost because if it's not, I love David Fincher. Seven's a B movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It is.
Come on, folks. Just like, you got to expand your palette a little bit, and you got to be willing to accept the fact that some of the things that you love, when you're going to the theater and you're watching Ant-Man and the Wasp, you're not watching Ingmar Bergman. You're not watching French New Wave, and that's okay.
Yeah.
There's space for both.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's ultimately one of the things that Scorsese's getting to when he talks about that type of things is that the space for the art house is getting, diminished more and more as the bigger blockbusters are basically taking up all of the oxygen.
Right.
I mean,
Well, but to push back on that, I know this is a little off subject. There's always been an ebb and a flow to film history.
Yeah.
And you know film history, and you watch everything. You're like me, right? And so you don't discriminate, right? So there was an era of which Westerns replaced musicals.
Mm-hmm.
The big shiny studio system musical, right? The big MGM musical was the thing.
Yeah.
And the big spectacle movies, and people were complaining at the time that the human drama films, the Streetcar Named Desire, the Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, that these movies were being choked out by these big gaudy musicals. These big dumb musicals were not leaving enough room for the Stanislavski method acting films that were the real filmmaking was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually the studio system and the musicals collapsed, and audiences didn't want that. And then you break into the 60s with the counterculture and the new Hollywood. And then in the 70s, you have things like Star Wars and Jaws, which brought back the B movies of the 50s and essentially brought them back with a new sheen on it and exploded again. You got all these high concept movies like Ghostbusters and Gremlins and all this sort of stuff. And then that kind of collapsed. And then we got the Quentin Tarantinos, and we got the rise of the indie filmmakers, the Kevin Smith. So there's always this ebb and flow of serious, 70s style human drama films, Easy Rider, Harold and Maude, and all of these like stripped down movies, and Kramer versus Kramer, and all this sort of stuff, and these more human movies, and then the pendulum swings, and we go into spectacle. And then the pendulum swings back. So I understand kind of what he's saying, but I'd also look at how many distribution models there are now. Look at how many, A24, which I love A24's movies, most of them, and I love Neon and a lot of stuff they produce. I may not be able to catch it at the local theater, but living in sunny tropical Akron, Ohio, I probably wasn't going to be able to anyways, because I don't live on the coast.
Yeah.
But I can now with a 7-day free subscription to Epix. I can watch Saint Maud, or with a Amazon Prime subscription, I can watch One Night in Miami, right?
Yeah.
Or Judas and the Black Messiah. I never would have got a chance to see that movie, especially with video stores being gone. I just would never have, unless my local art house theater is showing it, which it's a 1-screen theater, and they're showing 1 or 2 movies a week, and once they sell, and right now it's all virtual screenings. And I wouldn't be able to see it. I wouldn't be able to see First Cow, but I got to see it. I got to see it a heck of a lot earlier and loved that movie. Would it have been wonderful to see it on a big screen? But I probably wasn't going to be able to anyways. I think Scorsese, a lifelong New Yorker who also has a private, giant home theater where he's just watching old original prints of, Lawrence of Arabia and stuff like that, David Lean movies. He doesn't live where you and I live.
Oh no.
So
no. I mean, honestly, it's like he probably. I mean, if he asks his studio, hey, can I get like a print of or disc of whatever new movie he was interested in watching, chances are they're sending it to him. I mean,
exactly right.
But you're absolutely right, and I do think as frustrating as the past year's been, as in terms of somebody as far as movie theaters go, the escalation of the removal of the theatrical window and putting stuff on streaming, I think is going to bring that pendulum back to where indie films start to get some fresh air. It's like I hate that we missed so many of the movies that we were supposed to get last year. I love the fact that the movies that are dominating the conversation from last year are indies. Like, you're not necessarily talking about just the same 10 blockbusters over and over again.
Yep.
And I think that's wonderful. And I mean, it's a shame that what's happening to movie theaters, but at the same time, it's also a benefit because of the fact that it's meaning there's an escalation in the ability to get people to watch indie films and get
Well,
smaller films.
Well, because with the current distribution model, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about like the old school video store,
Yeah.
which is, we talked about transfers, these direct to video movies, but in the same way, right? In the same way, Black Widow has to be released in theaters nationwide, worldwide at the same time, because it has to gross $1 billion just to break even.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
To justify to shareholders of a giant corporation that hundreds of millions of dollars of investment into this movie was worth it. And to keep them happy because it has to be reflected on the quarterly earnings of a giant vertically integrated multinational conglomerate.
Yeah.
Nomadland and Minari just has to have people willing to spend $3.99.
Yeah.
Because they have much smaller budgets. And if they can get in front of more people, whether it be in a theater, which is likely not going to happen because Black Widow is going to be on 7 of 15 screens, right? Or whether it's Hulu buying the exclusive first rights for streaming and it's just integrated into your package that you're already paying $7.99 for, or Epix, or HBO Max or whoever. I think there's, like you said, I think there's more room now for the independents because they don't need to make $100 billion. If they make some of them, if they make $20 million, they're flush, right? And so if Amazon or Netflix or any of these companies are willing to pay $30 million for a movie that costs $7 to make, and now it's front loaded into the discourse because the stranglehold of, let's be honest, Disney, is breaking down, at least momentarily. Now we get to talk about Minari. Now we get to talk about Malcolm and Marie and Judas and the Black Messiah, and we get to talk about One Night in Miami. And we get to talk about movies that are made by women. We get to talk about movies that are made by people of color. We get to talk about movies that that doesn't preclude genre movies. We get to talk about movies like Bloody Hell and Psycho Goreman, and you know what I'm saying? So isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's what's exciting to me. I think yes, I wish I could see movies in theaters again safely. I can't wait until we're all vaccinated. We can go back to that. But in the meantime, we're just going to have to suck it up and go back to 1987 and start watching this stuff at home.
And honestly, like I love the fact that it's like I have the ability to, like, I can choose something out of my collection, or if I can go to one of these sites like Tubi or Prime or Hulu or Netflix and just browse and say, hey, that's something I might be interested in. Let me check that out. And or let me watch that, which I haven't seen in years. And it is wonderful to have all of these options. And it's like, no, not everything is streaming, unfortunately. I look forward to I really do hope that when Disney Plus brings its like PG-13 up films from Fox and all of that to that site, I'm looking forward to some of these older movies that like are not available anywhere. Being available because of the fact that it's like I don't have another way to watch them unless I like buy them on DVD, which there's nothing wrong with it, but maybe I don't necessarily want to buy that movie on DVD just now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So yeah, you're spot on, my friend.
So let's bring the conversation back. We went on a bit of a tangent, but the fact is, it's like it does fit into what we're talking about tonight in terms of these movies, in terms of B movies, and let's close out Trancers. I gave it a 5.8. Where would you put this?
6 out of 10.
Okay.
It's good, cheap fun.
Yeah.
You can watch it probably for free depending on what country you're in, and it's not even going to take up 90 minutes of your day. You'll probably get a couple of laughs intentionally or unintentionally out of it.
Yeah.
And it's not nearly as bad as you would think it is based on the title.
And the fact that there's 5 other movies in the franchise.
That's right. That's right.
So we are going to move to a 1989 movie called Leviathan, and this one is directed by George P. Cosmatos, who you will recall, if you are familiar with his name, it's probably for either Rambo: First Blood Part 2 or Tombstone. And this is I didn't realize, it wasn't until Jeb Stewart and David Webb Peoples are the screenwriters on this movie. It stars Peter Weller, Richard Crenna, Amanda Pays, Daniel Stern, Ernie Hudson, Michael Carmine, and Lisa Eilbacher, and Hector Elizondo. That is quite a cast.
And Meg Foster shows up. Yep.
Yes. And so this movie is essentially if it's a movie, because The Abyss came out in 1989 and it came out in August. This movie came out in March.
Yes.
And it's essentially The Abyss meets The Thing, which, believe me, is not a bad thing in this case.
It's Abyss meets Alien meets The Thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is and Costamos, if you're familiar with his work, he is a very solid director. Has a really terrific Jerry Goldsmith score. So this one is basically about a team of deep sea miners who are led by an oceanographer played by Peter Weller, and they come face to face with a creature of, basically a creature from the abyss, I guess is the best way to say. And it gets into the enclosure that they are in, that they live in, and they're 3 days away from their time being over in this run. And basically, if you've seen Alien, and The Thing, you basically know where this is going to go from here.
That's right. Well, what we got here, right, is we've got Cold War paranoia because they find a sunken, scuttled, no pun intended, Russian ship, and where some genetic modification sort of stuff was being done for Cold War purposes, and there's an accidental sort of contamination issue that happens, and it sets loose a series of things into motion. It's a body horror movie.
Yeah.
It's a monster movie. It's got a stacked cast of, at the very least, very qualified character actors. Jerry Goldsmith, who's one of my favorite film composers of all time, does a pretty good score for the movie. This is one. So the history of this movie is a little bit complicated for this reason. Once again, going back to B movies, The Terminator is a B movie. And so when Cameron is, he's basically writing scripts, and some of them were spec scripts, which is how he ends up writing Rambo: First Blood Part 2, I think. And he took it to the Cannon Group first, or the Cannon Group saw some of his writing because he was going to them to get some money to make some other movies. And they took his script and they made Missing in Action 2 and put it out before Missing in Action 1 because it was essentially a ripoff of his version of Rambo. And the same thing happened with The Abyss. So when the script for The Abyss leaked, there were 3 other clone movies that were immediately put into production and were put out before The Abyss made it to theaters. There was Deep Star 6, this one, Leviathan, and there's a third one.
Yeah.
And And they were all basically built on what they thought James Cameron's movie was going to be. Because there was a lot of mystery, because obviously he employed early CGI, which we'd later go on to use in Terminator 2 for the liquid metal T-1000 Terminator. So, there was a lot of conceptual stuff that they didn't know what he was going to try to do. So they kind of made a facsimile of that. This one lands on what if it was The Abyss, but Alien in the Thing, with a little Cold War paranoia mixed in.
Yeah.
This is one of those movies where it's like, it's almost good. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where it's the cast is fine. The script is a little bit paint by numbers, but there are some interesting interpersonal conflicts. Peter Weller plays Beck, he's the skipper of this crew, but he's not a roughneck. He's a geologist. And the company, which in the 80s, the company was always the bad guy, going back to Weyland-Yutani. And it's the company, and they've got to complete their mission to not forfeit their shares and their salary from, they're living in confinement. It's a lot about like how their day-to-day life, and they're almost like astronauts in a way, where they run and they use a skier and they do all this sort of stuff. And they're all antsy. They all have cabin fever, and they all want to get out. And all of them have nicknames, and all of them have, Daniel Stern plays a drunk pervert, so of course they call him Six Pack. And it's Amanda Pays is Williams, so they call her Willie, and all this sort of stuff. My issue with the movie, this is I don't believe in guilty pleasures, but this would be a guilty pleasure for me. I think there's two issues with the movie. One, despite the quality of the actors, it feels almost as if the actors know the type of movie that they're in and are play acting as opposed to acting.
Yeah.
I don't know how to describe that any better than what I just said, but it doesn't feel like they're actually acting. It feels as if it's I don't know how to describe it, but it feels as if self-aware is not the right term, but it feels as if it feels like rather than the actors being characters, the actors are playing caricatures.
Right. No,
but knowingly.
No, I understand what you're saying, because actually, and it's like I'll go on a little bit of a tangent here, personal tangent. So one of the things about 15 years ago or so, at the time I wanted to make movies. I wanted to write film music, and I wanted to make movies. And I had this short film that I worked on, and it's like we did it with I tried to do it with me and my friends and stuff like that. And it's like we were essentially playing versions of ourselves.
Yeah.
But it still required some acting, and that's not really something in any of our wheelhouse. So it's like you can tell that it's like we're trying to be the type of characters that we're trying to be, but we're just not good enough actor. Now again, we've got a really good cast here, and it's like, but one, it's like you mentioned these actors don't necessarily pull off being these type of characters.
No,
the same way the actors on the in the crew of Alien,
Bingo.
You completely believe them as those characters, as those type of people, as what they're doing. I mean, there's a naturalism.
Yeah. There's a naturalism in that film that this movie is like 180 degrees away from naturalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, I think Weller and Crenna are probably the closest ones to getting the type of characters that they're. I mean, Daniel Stern is fine as Six Pack, but it's like he's essentially Daniel Stern too. Like if you're familiar with Daniel Stern in other movies, he's essentially Daniel Stern. And it's like Ernie Hudson, I love as a presence in movies, but it's like he's so much more equipped for a character like Winston, which is more of a wisecracking character, than this character, which he doesn't really get a chance to do that type of thing in.
Well, I'm in agreement with you. I think the one person who feels native to the story and not a degree or two removed from their character is Richard Crenna.
Yeah.
I think Crenna is by far like the best thing in the movie, which is odd to say because he's just kind of a side character. Ernie Hudson, the best part of this movie to me is Ernie Hudson. His one line in this movie, and it kills me every single time because it's his delivery and it plays to his strength or one of his strengths, which is Meg Foster's on the thing and she's given the typical political 80s corporate spiel about like, oh, what a terrible thing, with no empathy whatsoever, but just corporate speak of, I can't imagine what you people have gone through. And this is by the time that all but 3 of them are dead and horribly mutated into a monster, right?
Yeah.
And he drops the line, gone through, bitch, we're still here. And that is one of the greatest lines because we see that trope so many times in horror movies. The evil corporation's like, wow, what you've been through. And nobody really ever says anything. That is an actual, what your reaction would be. Gone through.
Yeah.
We're still here. His delivery of that, it's not on par with like, I've seen shit that'll turn you white.
Yeah.
But it's not that far off. It's akin to, I think the second thing that disappoints with this movie is the ultimate creature design is very bad.
Yeah. So the makeup effect, the creature effects were largely by Stan Winston, and underwater there's some fantastic makeup effects.
Yes.
On par with Alien, on par with The Thing, and just on par with some of the best creature effects we've seen this entire decade. And then you're right, when the Leviathan basically comes after them at the end after they've escaped to the surface, it's not good.
It's like a giant catfish. It's a humanoid giant catfish.
The Kraken,
it's bad.
The Kraken in Harryhausen's Clash of the Titans holds up better than this. Like, this is obviously supposed to be something akin to that, but it's like you just can't sell it.
Well, what's really odd, they make this really good choice throughout the movie, which is throughout the movie, after the initial, there's some body horror elements of it because it basically starts off as that the crew members are the monster, essentially.
Yeah.
That the whatever this is that is reconfiguring their DNA, it gets into them and then it changes them into some kind of a monster. And if the monster bites you, you begin to mutate too. And at some point, all of these, it's like the thing where the parts and pieces are alive as well, where you cut a piece of it off, it's still alive, and it regenerates into even more freakishly, like a leg gets severed and the leg mutates into some kind of a weird tentacle monster. I think as long as the monster is either like body horror, like a Thing style mutation of a human being, or mostly obscured tentacle, weird H.P. Lovecraft sort of monster, I think those effects work pretty well. I think the moment where it all comes together like a Megazord and comes together in this giant thing, it's really nothing but a guy in a rubber suit or a puppet, and it's very obvious it's a puppet. It's not a particularly good puppet. It's not a particularly good animatronic. It's not a particularly good suit that a guy's in. It especially doesn't do good if you see it in HD. HD does this movie no favors. And I can only imagine this was either something that Stan Winston worked on very, very quickly and didn't have a lot of time with, or the final design doesn't feel finished because it really is just sort of a giant humanoid catfish with whiskers and all, right? And then sort of like this, but kind of like a catfish and a xenomorph with like human faces in its belly.
Yeah.
Like, because it's got and the one scene where it's kind of effective is when Hudson, I think, or maybe it's Amanda Pays, sees Richard Crenna's face obscured in shadow, and all you see is his face. And and it's not really him. He's been absorbed into this monster.
Yeah.
That's pretty effective because that's grotesque and it's body horror and it's mostly obscured. But at the very end, it's especially at the very, very end when it's just in daylight, when they're above the surface and it just comes up out of the water and kills Ernie Hudson out of nowhere. It feels very bad. And it's one of these movies that, like, yeah, it's a ripoff. It has enough to like about it, but the more the movie goes on, the more it kind of starts to fall apart, into and including where it's a Jaws ripoff where Peter Weller, instead of saying "smile, you son of a bitch," it's "say ah, you son of a bitch."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and he throws
and
a
he kills
flare in there, isn't it?
Yeah, he kills it the same way they kill Jaws, and then he punches Meg Foster in the face, which redeems the movie a little bit because that's also a human reaction. Yeah. When she's giving Bo sympathy when they tried to kill this crew and they already released a news statement saying they all died at sea. Yeah. And he finally gets out and then she's like, "Oh, it's so great that you made," he just clocks her right in the face. It's not PC. I wouldn't recommend it for real life. No. But it is a semi-satisfying payoff for the movie. But it's just one of those movies that I find myself going back to when I have insomnia and I can't sleep, because it either puts me to sleep or is just a nice, relaxing way to be up at 2:00 in the morning and have some fun. It's just falls short. Yeah. For a variety of reasons. And you look at it and you look at the director, you look at I think this was an MGM release, Dying Days of MGM. But you look at the cast, you look at the crew, you look at the score. So they put some money behind it. I just don't know if it was a rush job because they were trying to beat The Abyss and that they just didn't have time to fully execute it. But the sets aren't bad. They've got this pretty good set. It's odd. It's an odd failure, is what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I enjoy, with the exception of that last creature, it's like I enjoy the effects. Like you said, the sets are really good. They sell like the underwater stuff probably as well as anybody's sold underwater action. The Goldsmith score is always, like you. I mean, Goldsmith is always going to be a highlight of a movie like this. And yeah, I mean the creature effects up until the end are just really damn good and creative. Yep. And I mean, you really do get something out of the shock in seeing these effects up close when they're in that enclosed space. And then it essentially becomes Jaws at the end of the movie, where it's like after they escape. And I was disappointed that Ernie Hudson's character ended up dying. It's like, oh my God, a black man's actually going to survive a horror movie.
I'm always disappointed by that. Yeah, because he makes it through. I mean, when we say he makes it through the end, he makes it through to like the last 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And then they kill him. Like in a he just gets kind of drowned.
Yeah.
A guy in a suit drowns Ernie Hudson, and that's basically it. And I think, and the worst part of it is, if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure that was a reshoot. I'm pretty sure he originally survived. And so somebody out there needs to do a documentary on Ernie Hudson, because this guy is prime example of how people of color just get short shrift in Hollywood, especially of his era. To me, it's the equivalent of, he was always supposed to be the fourth man in Ghostbusters. And by always, I mean once they realized they didn't have Eddie Murphy, they realized they needed an entry point. They needed an everyman for the movie. Yeah. And lo and behold, they took his best lines in that film and they gave them to Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd. And he tells the story of Winston originally showed up way earlier in the movie, and it wasn't until he arrived on set that he didn't show up until like page 50, and all of his dialogue had been reassigned to the other people. And he almost quit the movie over it, and the person who talked him out of it was Harold Ramis. Yeah. Which is why he has an affinity for Harold Ramis and not so much the other folks of Ghostbusters. And if you ever see him interviewed about it, like, he didn't make any money, He would, you know, I mean, you know, he had to deal with the legacy and the phenomena of that movie, but didn't really get any of the rewards.
Yeah.
He was a working actor. He tried out to do the voiceover work for the real Ghostbusters to play Winston, and they said he didn't sound enough like himself. Then finally they brought him back for Ghostbusters 2, and they wrote him pretty much out of that movie. He wasn't even on the original poster for Ghostbusters 2.
Yeah.
I mean, so and then you have a horror movie here, like you said, Leviathan, which is now he's a principal cast member. He's not some guy that's coming in. He's a principal cast member, and by this point in time, he's a known name. He's not a marquee star, but he's a known name. You know, he's no more. You know, I would put him slightly below Peter Weller at this point in time. You know, it's like him, Richard Crennan, Peter Weller are the most known actors at this time here. Daniel Stern was still doing a lot of character work.
Yeah.
And yeah, they just choose to kill him off in the last 2 minutes of the movie. And it's just kind of an outrage. It's
yeah. Well,
it's very frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah, and I got a chance to meet Ernie Hudson several years ago at Dragon Con, and I mean, if you know, one of my favorite movies of all time is The Crow, and it's funny because of the fact that like in that movie, after the death of Brandon Lee, his character actually got beefed up in that one because they needed something. They needed something to help drive the narrative without Brandon Lee around anymore. And so when they rewrote it and reshot some of the scenes and stuff like that, they basically made him one of the much more of an important part of that. I mean, if you've ever read the original graphic novel, I mean, the character's in there, but it's like he's off to the side. It's so much more about Draven, but like and the way he performs that character, it's just a wonderful showcase for him and what he was capable of, and what people, if you gave him the opportunity, what he was capable of. And then it's like one of my favorite quotes of his, I think, is from his panel at Dragon Con that year that I went to, and he was talking about Congo, and like. It's funny, in Congo, he essentially plays the he essentially plays the cliche of the great white hunter in a way. And one of the funniest things he said about that experience is that he had people saying that he essentially out Tim Curry'd Tim Curry in that movie. And if you remember Tim Curry from that movie, he plays Tim Curry pretty well. And Ernie Hudson has just this wild accent, and it's just hilarious just how overboard he goes with it. But yeah, he is such a sweet guy, and it's like, it is a shame that like he didn't necessarily get the bump from Ghostbusters they probably should have, and didn't get nearly the recognition from it. But it's like I always like seeing him turn up in, whether it's TV shows, whether it's movies and stuff like that. It's always good to see him.
Well, here's the thing about Ernie Hudson is, no matter what he's in, no matter how much he's given or not given, he's never bad.
Yeah.
You know, he's not always great, but I've seen him in some stuff where he's actually pretty great too. You know, he had a great run on Oz and some other stuff, but he's never bad. You never see him in something and go, gosh, man, Ernie Hudson, geez, hang it up, buddy. Like, you never think that.
Yeah.
And I think had he been a person of color slightly later in Hollywood, or had Hollywood been more humane to people of color, I think at the very least he could have, he should have gotten a bump from Ghostbusters, because he does add something to that ensemble.
Yeah.
And if you're a kid and you grew up with that movie, you didn't make the distinction between Winston and the other three.
No.
Winston was just a Ghostbuster.
Yeah.
So, and same thing here. Like, I don't make the distinction between Ernie Hudson and anyone else in this cast. And so for them to just unceremoniously, through a reshoot, decide to kill this guy off because we need one more death at the very end, it's like, okay, what you could have, we need the guy to end up with the girl, so Amanda Pays can't die because
Yeah.
her and Weller have the romance, and so we need somebody. We need one more shocking death.
Yeah.
We need that last fright, and it was unnecessary in this movie because, as far as I'm concerned, the monster should have never come above water.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Leave it in the depths of the sea. So. I don't know. I enjoy this movie. If I were to give it a score, I think this is a different tier of movie. This was meant for true theatrical release. It was still a rush job. It's still a ripoff. It's still a B movie. But if you got Jerry Goldsmith and you got an actual credible director and a cast like this,
yeah,
I got to bump it up from Trancers, even though I think Trancers is probably a more fun movie.
Yeah.
I'd give this one, I think, a 7 out of 10.
Yeah, I would go with, I gave it a 6.9. I think so much of the production value just, like you said, just bumps it up a little bit more beyond Trancers. And yeah, I ultimately think I'm with you. Trancers is a more fun movie to watch, but yeah, this one, between Stan Winston's work, between the production values, between the Goldsmith score, yeah, there's just a lot more to like here from a quality standpoint that isn't necessarily going to be there in Trancers, but Trancers is more fun. So yeah, I would give it 6.9. And that brings us to the final film, which is a 1991 horror comedy called Popcorn.
Had you ever heard of this?
I think I had heard the title like once, but yeah, this was this was very much and I had to it's like this. I had to subscribe to like Funflix or something, whatever is that's on there, in order to watch it, and which it was worth it actually. I enjoyed how ridiculous this movie is. It's essentially, so this one it's funny because of the fact that it's essentially an early prototype of like Ringu and The Ring, I think. Like if
a little bit, yeah.
And then a little bit at the end of Peeping Tom, the Powell film from 1960.
Ooh,
and
there's
some crazy things in there. Dee Wallace is in this movie for a hot minute, and and then Ray Walston is in here, and it's directed by Mark Harrier, screenplay by Alan Ormsby. And it's basically about college students in a film course who are putting on an all-night horror festival at a movie theater to sort of raise awareness and raise money for the film program at the college. And there's a killer that is unleashed from a mysterious film that one of them finds. And that's where it sort of becomes The Ring, but then it also becomes like a serial killer movie. And I think one of the things that I wrote down in this movie is, so it takes place essentially during an all-night horror festival, and there are like 3 movies, and each one has like this different this different gimmick. And it's like one is sort of in 3D. One of them has like the seats that add to the effects and stuff like that, and then the other one is essentially smell-o-vision. And the first one is called Mosquito, and it's this cheesy B movie from like the 50s and stuff like that. And one of the things that I wrote down were, are they really going to show the entire screen of Mosquito? Because it does kind of feel like. Because it feels like they kind of are, and it's like, okay, they have some scenes that go, out of the movie, but ultimately they show what you essentially would imagine is like the entire movie. And it's funny because I will imagine those movies are all movies that they made for the purpose of this film.
Oh yeah. They were all made
And
for
and
this movie.
and,
Yes.
and they all have arguably better production value than the movie itself.
Well, what is most interesting about this movie in particular is that it's about 6 different types of movies in one. And
Yeah.
if that's not complicated enough, it's all of that plus it's a movie about movies with movies in the movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's meta on top of meta on top of meta. And I think what you can point to is you're pointing at The Ring, which I think is true. Peeping Tom, which I didn't even think about, but I do see the similarities. I also see some great similarities between this and the Scream series, Scream 1 and Scream 2 in particular.
Yeah.
And the opening of Scream 2 and the film studies class is almost verbatim the conversation they have in the film studies class in Popcorn.
Oh my God. Yeah, they do. Wow.
And
Because I haven't seen Scream 2 in ages, but I mean, yes, obviously the movie theater scene at the beginning of Scream 2. And then, I mean, that one scene where in the film class, it's like, that is.
And it's not just
true.
like two film. It's not just two film studies classes. It's the similarities are deeper than that. They're almost shot the same. The teacher's almost at the exact same place. If I were being generous, I would say that Kevin Williamson was an homage to Popcorn.
Yeah.
If I were not being generous, I would say he saw and ripped off Popcorn, at least that scene. And not only that, but you think about where Wes Craven would go with meta horror with New Nightmare just a few years later, where the evil comes out of the movie and becomes personified. And in The Mouth of Madness, just a few years before this, about books and movies as well, just a few years after this. And what you realize is what we talked about in the 1980s with all of these genre and horror cliches and tropes. By the time we get to 1991, you start to get a deconstruction of that.
Yeah.
I think the best thing that you can say about this movie is I truly believe that Popcorn is the first modern horror deconstruction movie. It's the first meta horror movie. I mean, you think about the humor of the Scream series and you think about the meta contextuality of the Scream series, because yes, it's all of these movies. They all have those William Castle-esque gimmicks to them. And the gimmicks end up becoming a part of the kills that the killer is using in the packed theater.
Yeah.
He's killing movie nerds who know movie tropes, who are pointing out movie tropes in the movies they're watching and then being killed by those tropes and those gimmicks.
Yeah. No, and man, I can't
It's
believe
wild.
I can't believe I didn't even think about Scream or like New Nightmare and In the Mouth of Madness, because I love all of those. And I mean, this, and I love how, and it's funny, like watching the film that they make, that sort of the possessed film called The Possessor.
Yes.
And it's like, it sort of begins, it actually kind of begins in a way, sort of like the eye, you could almost say it's like, oh, this is like Unshan Andalou, that short film that Buñuel and Dolly did together with the eye and the slicing of the eyeball. And it's like, it's there's so many references in this movie, and there's so many things that would come out of this movie. And it's like, it's hilarious to me that this is shot in Jamaica. And this is the movie with the other just really great, memorable, insane musical performance going on in the movie. Because the power goes out at the movie theater at one point, and then they bring out like this Jamaican this reggae band to essentially entertain the audience while the power is going back on. And it makes you wonder, it's like, well, how did they get power for like the amps and all that stuff as well? But at the same time, but I love both of these. I love both of these musical performances within the movies because of the fact that it's like I didn't expect either of them, and they really just point to just how crazy entertaining these respective B movies are, and it's like that. I do love the fact that it's like, yeah, each kill was essentially based off of the movie that the audience is seeing.
Well, so if we could try to identify the 6 movies that this movie is trying to be, the first one is it is a surrealistic because the sort of the inciting incident is there's this girl, she's a film study student, and she's having these very vivid, surrealistic, horrific dreams.
Yeah.
And she's taking her dreams and she's putting them into an audio recorder, and then she's going to turn them into a script for her first feature film. That's her desire.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's that aspect. There's this surrealistic horror nightmare, not so much David Lynch, but just kind of weird abstract horror dream movie. And then the theater that they decide to host the horror-a-thon in is called the Dreamland Theater, which is getting ready to be demolished. And so they want to send this theater out with a bang by doing this horror fest and raise money for their program and blah, blah, blah. So she's having dreams about horror movies, and then they're going to have horror movies in a theater called the Dreamland, which is obviously this whole meta narrative about how movies are like dreams, and especially in the days of film, when you have 24 frames per second, which mirrors REM sleep. And so the movement of the projector is very similar to rapid eye movement, which is when you dream. So they're obviously touching upon that. And some of that stuff is spooky and it's weird and it's good.
Yeah.
Then you have the horror comedy that's all about B horror movies. That's the second movie this is. Then you have the haunted, demonic, I'm thinking about Masters of Horror episode where Udo Kier had a reel of a movie where it was like an angelic snuff film, where they killed an angel on film, and then they showed it one time in France, and like it burned the theater down and blah, 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 because some of that plot is in this, where there's a cult. And here's something kind of clever about it. It's not cult movies. It's a movie cult. It's a psychedelic cult that was based around cinema. Their weird occultic doomsday religion was built around movies, and they were producing weird movies that critics, going back to our earlier conversation, were panning. And so the guy finally goes completely doomsday cult, Jim Jones, and is like, okay, for the final reel of the film, I'm going to kill my whole family for real. And if you don't believe my horror movies and you don't believe my whatever, you don't believe in my filmmaking, I'm going to make a real movie and I'm going to debut it, and you're going to watch real murder and not know it and blah, blah, blah. So then that movie is called Possessor, which is obviously Brandon Cronenberg would use that title for his most recent film. And it's this very disturbing stuff. And that kind of works. That movie sort of works.
Yeah.
And then the idea is that the killer is coming out of that movie like The Ring. So that's like your third film. Your fourth film is basically a slasher movie or a serial killer movie where that killer is going around and killing people. And then there's like at least a fifth film, which is like some sort of weird teen kind of romantic comedy kind of a thing. And that one doesn't work at all.
No.
And I think that is the problem. I think that they almost went too meta with this. I think they almost went the ideas in this movie are way smarter than they have any right to be.
Yeah.
It's not the ideas that are the problem. This is it's very original. It's very creative. This is not a ripoff.
Yeah.
It's an intentional homage to certain things. It's very meta. This movie should work so much better than it does, but it has so many good ideas. It ends up being scattershot with its good ideas a little bit. And then unfortunately it's undermined by the fact that most of the performers in this movie are terrible.
I mean, even like Dee Wallace is only in like 2 scenes in this movie,
Yeah.
and she's
Yeah.
not really in it again. And then Ray Walston's only in this for 1 scene, and that's
Yep.
about it. And then
That's about it.
yeah, I mean, and you actually brought up David Lynch earlier, and you when you were talking about like the film that they find, it got me thinking about his last feature that he's done, Inland Empire, where if I don't know if you've watched that, but if you watch that, there's an element of that story where the filmmakers that include Laura Dern and Jeremy Irons as the main actors, Justin Theroux's Jeremy Irons is the director, Justin Theroux and Laura Dern are the main actors in this movie that they're making, and it's basically a movie. It's basically a remake of, I think, a Hungarian movie or something like that, where that is essentially cursed, and like everybody associated with the film died. And so that actually got me when you were talking about that. That's where my mind went to, and yeah, I mean you're right. Like the ideas in this, I really enjoyed it because of the fact that it's very much a film nerdy movie in a lot of ways.
Yep.
The ideas in this are really well done. Even the films within films are really well done and well executed. But it, to a certain extent, they kind of needed to pick a lane and just go with it, and they really didn't. And it's like that's where having somebody like a Wes Craven, like a John Carpenter, would have worked for this movie, and did work when they made their own sort of reflexive horror movies later in the decade.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting here is that it's not that it's like, well, there's too many ideas and they're executed poorly. There's too many ideas, and some of them are concurrently executed fairly well. The surrealistic stuff is fairly well done. The cursed film, Possessor, some of that early stuff, and the voice, and she plays back her tape of her dreams, and he's on the tape talking to her, and some of that stuff is very, very well done. And the whole like haunted film reel, because they get 3 from this movie collector basically, and then the 4th one just shows up and no one knows where it came from. And the effect that it has on the main female protagonist, all of that works fairly well despite the lack of range and the woodenness of the acting. And there's some real creepy stuff in here.
Yeah.
And there's especially in the beginning, I think they do a good job of creating like a weird mood and an uneasy feeling. But then it's almost like in the second half they decide to lean way more into the comedy.
Yeah.
And the problem is it's not funny. The only thing that got a laugh out of me was when the killer is finally revealed. And I don't really want to spoil this one because I don't think anyone's ever seen it. So if you hear us, you're like, that sounds interesting enough to check out, but I don't want to completely spoil it. But when the killer is confronted by another character in the movie, that character asks, well, I'm in love with so-and-so, and does so-and-so love me? And the killer's response is, I don't know about love. I got enough problems of my own. I don't want to hear about this, because he's in the process of trying to kill all these kids.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have time to deal with all this sort of stuff. And if he were to deal with it, it would completely undercut his motivation for everything that he's doing. And I thought that was very funny. And there's a couple of like really and that's the other weird thing, is the killer ends up going into this sort of almost Jim Carrey-esque, over-the-top slapstick.
Yeah.
And the makeup effects, I think, are fairly well done, with the face ripping and all that sort of stuff, and the transformation. I thought some of that was pretty seamless, and it's all done practically or optically. I think that some of that was well done. So there's so much here.
Yeah.
That should, like, it's I don't know that, honestly, I don't know that I've ever seen a movie with this much potential from the script level all the way up that I'm just like, I'm not, I'm just, I don't know how to describe. It's like cinematic blue balls. It's like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, oh my God, this is so far ahead of its time, and it has so many good ideas. And if it were just 10% smarter and 20% better acted, I think this might be a true cult classic.
Oh yeah, I think so too. So a couple of things just looking at the trivia on IMDb that I think do kind of, some of these do, when you think about it, do kind of fit into why this movie ultimately doesn't work. Is that, so 3 weeks into shooting, the actor who played the main character was replaced by the actors who's eventually in the film.
Oh.
And I guess she didn't really, the Jill Sholin, who plays the main character, I guess she didn't have too much interaction with the cast since many of the scenes had already been filmed with the other actor. And they basically just made quick reshoots with her. So I think that's part of the reason why some of those scenes don't really work. But also, Ormsby, who had also written the screenplay for Paul Schrader's Cat People, he was originally directing it, and he was replaced 3 weeks into principal photography by Mark Harrier, who ended up directing it. And Harrier, this was the first thing he had ever directed. He was better known as an actor. He was in the Porky's movies, which was pretty much his biggest claim to fame. Otherwise, he's basically just been on a handful of TV episodes. But so I think those two things, I think, certainly fit into why this movie ultimately doesn't work the way it does.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's, let's see, Ormsby, because I did mention Cat People, but what else? Okay, so as a writer, he had written My Bodyguard, Cat People, Porky's 2, and then he would actually be, it's funny, he actually did additional story material on Mulan, funnily enough.
Wow, there you
considering
go.
what we talked about in yours. But yeah, it's like he had directed a couple movies in the 70s, Deranged Confessions of a Necrophile and The Great Masquerade. So this was, and those were in 1974. So this was going to be his first movie in like 17 years. And yeah, that's actually, it's interesting. Like when you think about, like, it doesn't surprise me reading all of this stuff, like why the movies is disjointed and just doesn't work collectively as a whole, because of the fact that it's like you have directors who were replaced for essential novices, you have actors who were replaced and then didn't really interact with the individuals that they're in the movie with. And yeah, I mean that's just gonna kill your movie. And it's like, it's a shame because, yeah, these ideas are so interesting and the execution of them to a certain extent is interesting as well. Like some of the creepier stuff they do get right.
That is the weirdest thing about this movie is, like you said, some of the execution, I'd say in many cases, like most of the execution, and like you said, the creepier stuff, they get right. It is creepy. It is unnerving. It's unsettling. They do a good job with mood and atmosphere and all of these, you know, this like surrealism, which I keep going back to, and all of that. And just, they do such a, but then at the same time, which makes sense now that you've dived into the trivia, at the core of the movie, it feels like there's something inert.
Yeah.
Which it's really weird that a movie with this many good ideas and in some ways, like, especially in the second half, like, such broad performances also feels inert. But when you realize that your main protagonist was basically just stitched into the movie through
Yeah.
haphazard reshoots. And what she had mostly been in it, because I knew her from somewhere, she was in The Stepfather, 1987 original Stepfather.
Yeah.
And I also knew her from Babes in Toyland and another movie that nobody thinks about but left a deep, deep, deep impression on me. The Jamie Farr horror movie, Curse 2: The Bite, where someone's bitten by a radioactive snake and their arm turns into a snake, and then they start vomiting snakes. And she's the female protagonist in that. And it's based on a movie. It's a sequel to a movie, but it's not a sequel at all. It just was a separate movie that was made, and they needed to tie it into something, so they called it Curse 2: The Bite, when I think it was really originally just The Bite.
So it's like Troll 2 in that respect.
Bingo, yes. And I've been looking to cover it for some time, so maybe if you have me back, we can talk about Curse 2: The Bite.
I'm curious to see this now.
It's terrible. Yeah, it was one of those Cinemax horror movies that played on repeat that I saw in the summer of 1980 something. But I have you ever seen a movie that where you're like, based on the merit of its ideas and based on even parts of its execution that you wanted to love? Like, I so badly wanted this to come together in the end in such a way that I could say here on Sonic Cinema, we have discovered a hidden gem. We've unearthed a treasure that was misunderstood in its time because maybe it was too meta, maybe it was, but it's just falls short of being a true cult classic.
I mean, I feel like and that's the most disappointing thing. It's like if the movie had been able to go through production cleanly with like one vision, one voice behind it, I think you will have had something. And I think you will have had something, like you said, this would be a genuine cult classic and one of those movies that, I mean, I still think to a certain extent, especially if you're a horror fan, I still think it's worth watching.
Yes.
To check out, to at least experience this movie and see what ideas there are. I mean, even if you're, if you're a fan of John Carpenter, Wes Craven, the movies that they made later in their career that have these sort of self-reflexive ideas about horror, I think it's completely worth watching for that respect. Just don't feel like it's going to be some sort of great discovery. I mean, that's the most unfortunate thing.
Yeah, that's it. And that's what makes my recommendation of it or my review of it so lukewarm, trending towards negative, is when you see you on the one column, you have the potential of what the movie could have been.
Yeah.
And then what it ends up being because of everything you've highlighted and not having that solidified vision, not having maybe a steadier hand behind the camera. And it's from a direction perspective, maybe a rewrite here or there, some better casting. And this is one of those things where I don't even think the issue here is budget. I think they took whatever money they had and they did a really good job with it.
Yeah.
They put it into the effects, and the makeup effects, like I said, are really well done. And the movies within the movies are well done. And the gimmickry of it all. And there's so much to like and maybe even love about this movie. And yet the finished product, potential to realization, isn't there. And unfortunately, rather than saying, hey, this is a great discovery, what you actually have discovered is a footnote in horror history, which is this is the start of the deconstruction trend that would be so popular in the 90s all the way through to crap like Urban Legend. It really does. It starts here.
Yeah.
And man, what this movie could have been,
Yeah, I mean,
it's still worth a watch, though. I'd still say
it's worth a watch. I mean, it's worth checking out. I would say if I was going to grade this, I mean, I want to grade it higher just because of the ideas, but I mean, I would probably say like 5.6, 5.7, just in terms of the production value, or just in terms of the way it comes together. Like,
this is a movie that my heart, like you said, based on the ideas, my heart wants to give it like an 8.
yeah,
My head, based on how completely inert our characters are, especially the main female protagonist, maybe no fault of her own, but I've seen her in some other things, like I said, wasn't very good in those other things either. I got to give it, I think, like a 5.5.
yeah,
Yeah, it's just it's ends up being very middling at best when there's just so much they could have done with what they had, and it just doesn't come together in the end, which is really a great disappointment. It's I get more frustrated and I'm more critical about movies with promise that fall short than movies that are just we're shit and we're always going to be shit and are always going to be shit.
yeah,
There's certain movies that it's just the basic idea of it wasn't going to be any good. So I'm not surprised that the final result isn't any good. This is the opposite of that.
Yeah.
This is where it's like, not only did they get it a lot of it on the page, they ended up getting a lot of it on the screen, and it's still not that good. It's frustrating.
yeah. It's a shame. I'm glad I watched it. I'm glad
too.
glad I checked it out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm with you. It's like if this had stuck the landing, this could easily be like up there with In the Mouth of Madness, with Scream, with
Yep.
New Nightmare as one of the great self-referential horror movies of the 90s. But yeah, it just doesn't work. It's like all of these great ideas are just wanting they're ideas in search of a vision, and it's a shame. And
That's a great way to put it.
It's, yeah, I hate that it's, and I hate that it sort of leaves this trilogy of this three films that we've talked about sort of on a downer note, because of the fact that this could have easily been the very best movie we
Yep.
both saw for this episode. But yeah, it just wasn't meant to be, and that's disappointing.
I think though, if you're a Sonic Cinema listener, or you're a binge movies listener who's come over for this episode, I think if you are a genre fan in particular, like you said, Brian, if you're a horror fan, and if you're that movie obsessive that we talked about at the beginning, who's most likely listening to this, and you haven't seen it, then I think you really should see it.
Yeah.
I think there are things to like about it. There are things to enjoy about it. There are moments and segments of the movie that do work, where what we're down on is the total package. The finished work falls short, but there are 10, 15-minute stretches of it that are really good.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think we're so down on it, is not because it's like crap all the way through.
Yeah.
It's because it's just oddly stitched together, really good parts and pieces, but the whole is not greater than the sum in this instance.
Yeah, I mean, if this movie had been unwatchable, it's like that would have been one thing, because it's like at least you could say, well, I mean, just nothing about this movie works. But the problem is there are so many things about this movie that you want to see work. And it's like the ideas are there, but it just doesn't come together. And it's funny because of the fact that it's like, I wasn't quite sure what to expect with these three movies, but I'm really glad that I have all three of these movies that I can say that I've seen and I've thought about, that I've talked about, and each one was a discovery in its own way. And I really do appreciate you bringing these movies to Sonic Cinema for this discussion. This was a lot of fun of a discussion to have.
Well, I appreciate it. I know we went off on some tangents. We went a little long, But you know what? That's what happens when you're talking about three movies where here's the point I think we've proven here today. I think we've proven the point that you can take three movies that most people haven't heard of or haven't seen a long time, that if you just read the Wikipedia entry to be like, these are not worth reconsideration or discovery or watching or certainly not talking about. And yet we had a great conversation about them.
Yeah.
About each and every one of them, and there was all kind of connections we made to all kind of different things. And that's the great thing about being a film fan, and that's the great thing about being a film fan who listens to film podcasts like Sonic Cinema or Binge Movies, is that's the best part about the community that we're a part of.
Yeah.
You know, the rest of the discourse that you touched on, those are the crappy parts of being a part of the film fandom community and the film critic community and film reviewer community. But what we got to do here today, what you gave me the privilege of doing here today, by picking movies, talking about them, discovering them, rediscovering them, talking about them together, it's very fun. I'm deeply honored to be here. You've been doing this for a very, very long time. You know your stuff. You're very well versed, very well read, very well studied, very well watched. And I appreciate you having me on, and it was my pleasure. And I just can't thank you enough. And I don't have to praise you and all that much because your listeners already love you. That's why they're listeners.
Yeah. And I do appreciate it. It's been, it's like one of the things I've wanted to do this past year with COVID and with a lot more free time on my hands than I expected to have, is I've wanted to really get to know a lot of the people that I've started to know online and on Twitter and stuff like that. I mean, it's one thing to engage with other people about movies on Twitter. It's another thing to engage with them in like a one-on-one format like we're doing now, and just talk about movies and analyze movies, discuss what works in movies, what doesn't work. And it's like, that's one of the hardest things to do because you can't really properly analyze a movie in 280 characters. It's just, you just can't do it. And, so whether you're listening to podcasts like Binge Movies, or, I mentioned A's All Over, RIP to A's All Over, but like Junk Food Cinema and any other podcast that just really enjoys the process of discussing movies, it's well worth your time. And same goes with people who write about movies. I mean, I think writing about movies long form is extremely important. And I think, even if it's just like a review every now and again, or even if it's just collecting thoughts on a movie for a discussion like this, it's important to be able to write down your thoughts about movies, I think, in a way that you can succinctly explain why a movie works or doesn't work for you. And that's one of the things that it's like, this was not overnight for me. It's like, this is like, we talked about a little bit on Binge Movies, where it's like, I've been doing this at least in writing for 20 plus years. Right. I mean, really, I've been doing I was doing fan commentaries with friends of mine before I turned to podcasting. And and one of the things that I wanted to do when I started the podcast was, there were people beyond my circle of friends that I've always talked about movies with, that I wanted to talk to. And whether it's filmmakers about their own work or about other people's work, or other film bloggers, podcasters online, it's like, I want to have those interesting conversations and interactions. And it's like, it's like, I have friends who are pre-venters when it comes to movie watching. It's like, we wouldn't have necessarily ever talked about movies like this. And it's like, that's one of those things where it's like, I'm really grateful to get to know filmmakers and film podcasters where it's like, they can bring things to me that it's like, I wouldn't have necessarily thought about myself. And yeah, I appreciate you coming on the show. I appreciate you having me on the show. Would love to join you again on Binge Movies. I would love to have you back again on Sonic Cinema, despite what I said earlier in the week for 5 minutes into transfers. But no, this was a lot of fun. And yeah, I mean, even the tangents, if you listen to the show entirely, you understand why we went on those tangents too.
It's exactly right.
Yeah. But Jason, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Oh, once again, my pleasure. Deeply honored. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for letting me have a great discussion about 3 random ass movies. It was great. And you know what? It turned out they weren't so random after all.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, and that was one of the best things. It's like, I've done other episodes where it's like it's about a certain filmmaker or certain types of movies where it's like, yeah, it's like you basically are talking about the same type of movies with those, or it's like you're talking about within the context of a filmmaker's career. But it's like, I love the fact that these were completely random, and then when you start to watch them, you realize that they're not that random, that there is something ultimately to these movies that you wouldn't have necessarily picked up on otherwise if you'd just been watching them together. And I think that's one of the things that's great about what you guys do on Binge Movies is the fact that it's like, you can, even if you're just talking about box office, like you can take 5 movies that were the main commonality is how much money they made, and then as you go through them one by one within the context of that, why was it necessarily that these movies may have risen to the top in this particular year where other movies didn't? I mean, we had, in our discussions, we had like 2 movies with Chris Rock in them, 2 movies with Eddie Murphy in them, and it's like
That's right.
we had these. And you see these connections, and it's like, okay, that's why they made what they did, and that's why they were as successful as what they were. And it's like, it's great to be able to just talk about movies in that respect, and just and just have a good time talking about different movies and looking for those commonalities. So if you haven't checked out Binge Movies, I highly recommend it. It was a lot of fun. I'll tweet out whenever my episode gets released, and I will tweet out in general because Binge Movie, I do love the format, and I appreciate you for what you guys are doing with that. I really enjoy the podcast, and I definitely recommend it if you enjoy listening to people talk about movies.
Oh, thank you. I'm I'm humbled by that. I really appreciate it, and likewise, anything we can do to help out Sonic Cinema, just let me know, man. We're here for you. Yep.
I'd like to thank Jason for joining me on the podcast. Like I said, check out Binge Movies wherever you listen to podcasts. It was a great honor to be a part of his podcast, and that is probably going to drop sometime around late April. So be on the lookout for me to promote that. And there are going to be a couple of other podcasts that I'm going to be on, starting to branch out in that respect, and talk to some of my other fellow film aficionados. That's it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. You can check us out at www.sonic-cinema.com, at Apple, Google, and Spotify podcasts, and at the Patreon at www.patreon.com/Sonic Cinema, and the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. There are going to be some great episodes of the podcast coming up. And thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.